당은 기본 등기 남녀는 비게 남자 시거와 되는자 당은 그진나 이제 당은 거기에 동안 타달래 저거 뭐래서 지상은 거기에 동안에 저지 탈바세 토고 고고와 지상다 탈바 토발라 탈바 토고도 선배 탈바 되니기 삼바지 고고래 지상 안 주기라 람 냠린 제세를 고가래 주 당보 가원 주었으나 탈바 되니기 삼바들에 탈바 되니기 삼바지 하는 가주 기디기나 로제마 마인 바지 가주길래 기기여바이나 기여바는 람냠 람귤에 깨바래서 그래 지상 탈바 되니기 삼바세 지난다 탈바 되니기로 디게라 탈바 토고도 선배 되니기 듬바 숙침보지 깨와라 안에 가르고 그래서라나 코위기 동알이야 코월에 견 통고 그래서 코월에 견 마타바나 코월에 탈두게 삼바기 말에 코월에 탈두게 삼바마기나 안에 코월에 탈바 토고도 선배 삼바데 두고 말에 인자 나 코월에 탈고도 선배 삼바 숙침보지 레발라 코월에 견다고 그래서 지난 코월에 견대 코월이 냐와이다 둔로 안에 가지고 라다 미디게로와 디네자다 당아주 기신 동화 시에도 당아주 밀리께봐 이나야 안에 동화 된데 요래서지 신다 밀리야 동화 지금 아주 시에다 가지고 되바자야 미니비게 가서 마주비 동화세 디고시 기신 아주 디고시 살아와다
Good evening. So last week we continued to look at the practices that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So practitioner of intermediate capacity is someone who's given rise to a strong and overwhelming wish to be freed of suffering, and not just suffering in general, but in particular the sufferings that pervade cyclic existence. Someone who's given rise to an uncontrived wish, in other words, a wish that spontaneously arises in all situations, that is ever present, a wish to attain liberation from suffering. So this is a practitioner of intermediate capacity, someone who has given rise to such an uncontrived wish for freedom from suffering, freedom from being bound in the realms of cyclic existence. And such a practitioner then, when they have this uncontrived wish, they have a mental path, they have achieved a path. In order to become such a practitioner, one needs to generate this uncontrived wish to be freed from suffering. In other words, this wish that pervades every activity, whatever one is doing, or a conversation one's engaged in, or thought process, always at the forefront of one's mind is this needs to ensure I attain freedom from suffering. At the very least, I cannot create further causes to remain in cyclic existence. So in order to give rise to such a wish, one has to reflect in detail on the sufferings of samsara. To the extent that one has not reflected on the sufferings of cyclic existence, one will continue with one's life, not giving rise to any thought about freedom from cyclic existence. But to the extent that one has reflected in detail, to that extent, one will give rise to a sincere wish to be freed from pain and suffering. Cyclic existence itself is divided into two groups, the lower and the upper realms. The sufferings of the lower realms, of beings born into the hells or the spirit realms or the animal realms, we looked at earlier in the year, in February. And now we are in the context of looking at the sufferings experienced by humans in the high realm of the human realm. And that's where we continue tonight. Looking at in the context of sufferings of humans, in the eightfold division of suffering, we come now to the eighth suffering. So here we are in our text on page 29, the paragraph second from the bottom.
sugi pumbo da an choyi pumbo dushi pumbo duji pumbo number shi pumbo ngadi ro this dinga di shi orda dinga di shi kore.
This eighth suffering, to give it its full name, is the suffering of having the 5 contaminated aggregates. So, we have it translated here as taking a samsaric human form. Human form refers to being born in a human realm, but the full translation is the suffering of having the 5 contaminated aggregates. So having been born due to contaminated karma accumulated by our own afflictions, we have the 5 contaminated aggregates, mental and physical, of form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness.
That's it. Nyalini pungbo de langzam ji se dina ane na ka chiwa so dunga yi ten jes. Da nyawalim be ngana ju le da nyumo ju ngana ju pungbo de se or da le da nyumo ju ngana ju nyawalim ngana ju pungbo de le nyawalim pungbo la gor da. Kasin le da nyumo ong ju wa. Da ngana ju pungbo de da ngana ju pungbo di da di dunga yi ran shi re. De le mingarsan chawa du ji dunga se or de ngana ju 차바도 지기 동화세들이 세상에도 풍부 동화이라시리 해서 그래.
The text starts, in short, having merely taken a samsaric human form under the force of karma and afflictions. So here again, this is referring to that we have no freedom in terms of our rebirth. It happens without any control from our side. It's propelled by our contaminated karma that we accumulated due to our afflictions. And therefore, we continue to take rebirth after rebirth within the realms of samsara, within these 5 contaminated aggregates. These aggregates are in the very nature of suffering, in that they are the basis upon which all suffering is experienced. So this physical and these mental aggregates are in the very nature of suffering.
나 나가 저기 동화들 동화유 동화세다 유유 동화세다 차바도 동화 숨여로 봐다. 나 저기 망제다 동화세다 가지고 강아도 동화도 세다 가르치고 왔으네. 나도 동화유 동화데 가지고 하고 보러 봐다. 동화데 가지고 동화레스 다디 동화데 가지고 거는 교요도 베네 수보라 나즈다 나즈 소와 잡고녀야디 다 동화세가 딩가서 하고 보라다 되네게 소와도 녀야도 당나게 동화 끼우면서 사진가 저기 강아도 세디 시거와 디 가지고 하고 보래 동화도 락바락바디게 근데 다 되네게 다 될래야 유유 동화세디 당가지고 소와 사지게 소와 대바디게 유유 동화 다 내가 당가지고 이마저지 저에다 끼우르시나 양 가슴 제길리지 규지 동화 잘 내용으로 대산 사지게 대바디게 유유 동화세 대소야 가지고 그 동화서 하고야 되었을래 나와래. 당아서 깔래 가셔도 가르쳤네. 차바두지 동화서에 가지고 풍보디 가지고 동화 임바디 기네 하고 그거 말다 가지고 하고 고야리야 깔래 가셔 책고래.
Back at the beginning of June, we spoke about a different way to divide the sufferings that pervade cyclic existence. Since then, we've been going through the eightfold division, but at the beginning of June, we looked at a threefold division, which we see just under here, the 3 sufferings. So these were, the first being the suffering of physical and mental pain, the second being the suffering of transient happiness, and the third being all-pervasive suffering, or to give its full name, all-pervasive suffering of conditioning. These 3 in brief then. The first is the suffering that in the world everyone agrees is suffering, the suffering of physical and mental pain. This is all our physical experiences that are unpleasant, unwanted, as well as all mental experiences that are unpleasant, unwanted. So these in general, certainly the coarser levels, are recognized as suffering, and everyone agrees we want to be freed of these. So this first type of suffering is known not just by humans, but by animals too. The second type, the suffering of transient happiness. This is slightly more hidden, but hearing about it, one can come to understand it without too much difficulty. In brief, the suffering of transient happiness is the normal experiences of happiness in the world. So whatever pleasant feelings that one experiences, this is from the Dharma perspective, is considered suffering because it's transient. We long for it to be lasting, but it never is. It always ends. So the second type of suffering is the suffering of transient happiness, worldly, mundane, ordinary happiness. The third type, all-pervasive suffering, this is much more difficult to understand. This is the suffering that pervades all experiences within samsara, all cyclic experiences within cyclic existence. So the first type of suffering, this is easy to understand. Everyone recognizes it, certainly on the coarser levels. The second type, that of transient happiness, is more difficult to understand, but it can be fairly easy. But the third, that of all-pervasive suffering, this is more difficult to recognize.
다 dunga 세디 여서디 가와 요르스는 아주 되바 되비기 미자 할을 용거래 되비가 하자 미라 dunga 세디 용거래 dunga 세디 dunga 세디 가와 요래 람나 되비기 하다 되비 밀 용거래제 요래제 되발랍들 난도다 되발랍들 난도 차산도 냐와 이다 dun르선 되발봐 제산 되발마도 영어요 말이지 되발인 거래제 되비기 감디기 내겐디기라 아니 둥아도 요래스 아니 유에 둥아 요래 잡아두지 순가요 순가인 거래.
These three types of suffering are experienced by beings who are included within the six realms of the desire realm. So when samsara is divided into different realms, the realm we find ourselves in is the desire realm, which has six realms. Those are the three lower realms, as well as humans and gods. So here, beings here experience all three types of suffering.
ane kam sumji de dane sukham sume kham sene kam ni ji gore da jang zo debi kham na lo la ande ne gen de la ane dunga sunga yo ba che da suji kham na la samdan dang bo ni bo sumba se de da shi ba kha shi yo re dina de da samdan dang bo se ni ba so sumba se ande so la ane gar yo re se ne gyuru dunga yo re kya ba du ji dunga yo re ne dunga se de yo ma da kon so la kam go me la le ya dunga se de yo ma re.
And samsara then is divided into three. You have the desire realm, where we abide, and then there the realms of the form and formless realm. Within those, just like the desire realm has 6 subdivisions, the form realm has 4. And of those 4, the first 3, they have no suffering of physical and mental pain, only the sufferings of transient pleasure and all-pervasive conditioning, the second and third type. So again, when the desire realm is when the samsara is divided into 3 main realms, desire, form, and formless, then the form realm, has 4 subdivisions. The first 3 subdivisions, there they experience only the suffering of transient happiness and all-pervasive suffering, no suffering of physical and mental pain.
안 수메비 감 세대 라디솔래야 다 규리 가서 캬바두지 동안 마도 네 규리 동안 세요 말다 동안 세요 거 말에 순간 거 말에.
On the fourth level of the form realm, as well as the entire formless realm, there only all-pervasive suffering is experienced. There is no suffering of physical and mental pain and no suffering of transient happiness. Those are not experienced. Just the third type, all-pervasive suffering. This is the only suffering that's experienced on the fourth or the highest level of the form realm, as well as by all beings within the formless realm.
제가 잡아두시 동아스디 내다 녀몽 중 풍보디 아니 되베 가사제 감 가사래 열에 아니 수에 라래 열에 내다 녀몽 라이나다 미나다 다 두로냐와 수인의 차상을 유딩해 지리 제가 인자 잡아두시 동아래 해지래 나다 동아에 동아들라 아니 가서네 되발로마도 매반장 차상을 켜요 말어 코와바 차상을 매바래 민자 차상을 켜고요 말해 이디나신 유의 동아세야 되게 아니 되바다 감고면 수기를 하가실마도 안 차상을 코와바 차상을 요 말에 매반장 혼줄에 권니들라 잡아두시 동아라고 말 가서 차상을 켜고요 말어 진짜 레다 녀모 지금 풍보들라 녀랭이 풍보세야지 다 거기게 코바 차상을 유지해 봐 인자 아니 콜밍 안 잡아두시 동아스 민다고 그래.
So if you're wondering why are we hearing about realms which we don't perceive, in particular these form and formless realms, the purpose of presenting this is to explain why the third of the three types of suffering, all-pervasive suffering, is called all-pervasive suffering. And that is because it is experienced by all beings in samsara, no matter where they are born. All samsaric beings are born due to their contaminated karma accumulated by their own afflictions, and therefore they have contaminated aggregates. And every samsaric being's aggregates are contaminated, and that means they are in the nature of suffering. And which of the three types of suffering? This third type, all-pervasive suffering. And it's all-pervading because it pervades all of cyclic existence. Or to express it differently, the third type of suffering pervades all beings within cyclic existence because it pervades their aggregates. This is not the case for the first two types of suffering, the suffering of physical and mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness, because those two types of suffering are not experienced by all beings throughout cyclic existence. Just the third type is. Hence, it's called all-pervasive suffering, and it is the suffering that is having contaminated aggregates, the basis of all suffering.
나 녀링이 풍보디 시도 녀링이 풍보디라 저기 캬바두지 둥하라 그러다 지상 콜 캬바두지 둥의 김생 가르에 랍데다 지시고라 녀링이 풍보디 랑잠기 체디나 아나 체디르 나가치 시데 제가 레다 녀모 풍보디 랑와인자 기용도네 제가 줄이야 가위 그서 나위 둥하다 가위도 칭야도 치유 둥하 아니 영하게 긴지고 그러지 제가 아주 레다 녀몽아주 풍보디 녀링이 풍보디 여바 인장 안에 기와 기제 가위 동화세다 기위 동화디 뭐 가위 동화디 뭐래 안에 치유 동화디 용고레스 제가 기위 동화 가위도 치유 동화기 덴지고 그래서 디 덴데스고 제가 덴지고 그래지.
Looking at our first line here, the name of this eighth type of suffering that's been looked at is the suffering of having the five contaminated aggregates. So we don't see that in the text, but that's the suffering that's being referred to. If I was to literally translate this first line again, it would be merely having the appropriated aggregates. And then it would continue from the comma, you must face the sufferings of, etc. So that first line literally is merely having the appropriated aggregates. The translator translated in a different way to make it clearer to the average reader. But appropriated aggregates means aggregates that one has taken under the control of contaminated karma. They were appropriated or taken without freedom. And therefore, these aggregates, these contaminated physical and mental aggregates, are the basis for all suffering. And here then the line continues. You must face the sufferings of birth, sickness, old age, death, and so forth. So these appropriated aggregates, or these contaminated aggregates, are the basis upon which all suffering is experienced. Hence, they are the illustration of the third type of suffering, that of all-pervasive suffering. merely having these aggregates, we have the basis upon which all suffering is experienced, all physical and mental suffering is experienced.
gaya gawi dunga gengo chayo mare ane chiwi dunga seyo mare ane nayo dunga naya yo mare subole naze tanya tang dine yo mare ane ko dade dewa che yang je dunga yo dine gyuro ya dine yo gyuyo dunga yo mare ane kar sore gyuyo dunga yo mare ane gawi dunga nawa seya na shiye seya yo me mare kar sene di konzu 풍보 di 차와두지 동아 말해 다지 가르스나 레다 뉴모 옹 중에 풍보래요 말해 매반자 하는 가위 동아세 나위 동아 치위 동아세디 매버래 매바자 가와 나와 치와 용고 말해 당아로 주기 풍보디 레다 뉴모 옹 중 풍보 인자 하는 차와두지 동아세 차고래 디네 인자 레 나주 풍보들라 때네 나야요래 하는 가위 동아 차 치위 동아 용하데 나주 풍보들 레다 뉴모 옹 중 풍보들 용고래 le pungpo ina ya le da nyomo ngu juwa ma ina ane gawe duwa na yue duwa chi yue duwa zi yungo ma des bine janshu sema pabe ki gulu dike chaza tak chaba duji duwa ma re ane le da nyomo ngu juwa ma re ma inza gawe duwa yo ma na yue duwa yo ma chi yue duwa yo ma re se wale sume zuki mechida da lame dachum topsene ko dachum ba jigero de koranzo kuli de sewa da zu da sume de ba yongre zuki ka damara yongre de dishi anyanga le de sen yangja pha ke wale ne kuli shoro wa di sewa lame nya de dachum pe su kuli sewa.
What this first line then is showing is that as long as one has appropriated aggregates, or to express it differently, contaminated aggregates, one has the suffering of having the 5 contaminated aggregates. And therefore, one has the basis for all suffering, such as birth, sickness, old age, and death, and so forth. So those 4 were what we looked at a month to 6 weeks ago. But not all. So this is the situation for all beings within samsara. Those beings who have passed beyond samsara, who have attained freedom from samsara, their situation is different. They take birth, but they don't suffer experience the suffering of birth. They have no requirement for aging, sickness, aging, or death. They do not experience sickness, aging, or death. So this specifically refers to beings who are liberated, who are freed, who have attained freedom from samsara. These are foe destroyers, or the Sanskrit is arhats, who have attained the level of being an arhat without remainder. Secondly, Arya Bodhisattvas, and not ordinary Bodhisattvas, but Arya Bodhisattvas, as well as Buddhas. These 3 classes of beings, they have aggregates, but not contaminated aggregates. And this is because their aggregates were not achieved, their physical and mental aggregates were not achieved due to the force of contaminated karma. So they don't have contaminated aggregates because the cause was not contaminated karma. Contaminated karma is the karma accumulated with the presence of the afflictions. Their aggregates were accumulated due to pure karma. In other words, the motivating intention was completely free of afflictions. So therefore, having uncontaminated aggregates, they take only controlled rebirth not uncontrolled rebirth, and they never suffer from birth, aging, sickness, or death. So these beings, being liberated, are in a completely different position from us ordinary samsaric beings.
that later nyomo onge jungwi phungbo de mayimba chaje phungbo de yi rashi lu sa de ane ngo ju go re jesa de ne za phungbo de ya su ki phungbo de so ya de chige la ba la ga ju ge su bol ya je na se ta ya da de ne ka go ngo ma ne ka wi du wa sa da de ne chi ya du wa de ge ngo ma ro jesa ko lam nyamnen ji be lam yu to pye dang bo de ga su bu di later nyomo onge jung phungbo ji ina ya ko lam nyamnen je je ne gom be to pye For
ourselves as very ordinary beings, we have our aggregates are contaminated, therefore we have the basis to experience suffering such as birth, aging, sickness and death. However, if we make concerted effort in our spiritual training and we develop minds such as love and compassion and generate bodhicitta, as well as the wisdom realizing emptiness, we attain mental paths. First, the path of accumulation. As we develop and progress through this and develop the path of preparation, as we continue to train, when we achieve the path of seeing, and this is the path of seeing of bodhisattvas, this is where the bodhisattva realizes emptiness directly. Here they accumulate karma that is not contaminated. And with the achievement of the path of seeing by a bodhisattva, their body changes, their aggregates change. They no longer have this coarse physical, this body that has been acquired under the influence or under the control, or due to contaminated karma. They now achieve a mental body. To someone who observes them or sees them, they look no different. But their body no longer is the basis for the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death. And this is because of their mental development. Hence they achieve what's called a mental body. So this can be achieved whilst one is an ordinary samsaric being, but through extensive training, transforms one's mind, and thereby when one realizes emptiness directly as a bodhisattva, then one achieves a mental body, a body that doesn't suffer from birth, aging, sickness and death.
세상 아주 풍부 뒤여반상 풍부 될라 때네 아주기 아주기 네 지게 량한 바사야당 근데 소주에 류유권에 다 되니까 신신 소주제야 안샤래 내버제야 안가그 류가 있으면 그 뒤내용 바자 안디 체치미게 동아 몽부기에게 냐와다 이다다 둔로 동아 녀야기 깨바지 규사고래 제다 세상 체치미 동아 잼버지 세도 깨와 치미게 동아 녀야기 유디기 양쪽에 된데라 사고래지.
That's one key point that the text presents. And the second then comes with the next sentence. As well, you use your precious human life largely as an instrument to produce more causes of lower rebirth and for greater misery in the future. So this refers to the fact that our minds are still under the sway of the afflictions. The afflictions dominate us so. And therefore, our thoughts are often or largely influenced by the afflicted minds, meaning we are accumulating not only contaminated karma, but quite likely to be non-virtuous karma. And if our mind is in that direction, so too will be our behavior and our speech. So what this is referring to is so much of our activity leads to the accumulation of causes, of karma, that when it ripens at the time of death may well propel a rebirth into the lower realms, as well as further suffering experiences in this and future lives.
풍보 될 때네 안 규유 동아 리고래 규유 동아 리고 지사 당아서 규유 동아도 요색이 뇌를 마선 디레 자월 마선 당아서 풍보 될 때 리고래 지사 되네 상아서 풍보 되다 동아 요야당 규유 동아 요야기 근데 띠엔로지 디지고래 제 뇌로 시에제.
The text continues. A samsaric form is merely a vessel holding the suffering of mental and physical pain and the suffering of transient pleasure. So this physical and these mental aggregates, they serve as the basis upon which all suffering is experienced. So having them there, it's like a vessel upon which we experience all the suffering experiences that we do, both coarse as well as subtler. So as long as we have contaminated physical and mental aggregates, we will suffer.
디니게 삼다쟁아 저기 대 풍보틀래 땅아 저기 풍보디 동에 캬와두지 동에 임바데 디니게 삼다야 제바제 디니 제바제 오래세다 다 지상아 저 풍보디 여반자 깨와다 가와다 나와다 치유도가 차상 델레트니 용고도 나 풍보 델레 때네 아니 깨와 쳇델레 풍보 델레 때네 가 저기 디바다마라 사신데네 깨와 치메 동안요하게 규리에 델레트니 용고도 풍보 델레 때네 여반자 델레 때네 동아 리기도 규에 동아 리기도 세상 땅 그 풍보디 다 동아에 라시 동아에 뇌 라시 레샤 선비다 숨바델이야 뭐 차와 뒤지기 동아 라시 임비에 세다 세상 풍보디 차와 뒤지기 동아 세디 데니기 레다 녀모 다 동아 차상 용사게 시띠 다딩 풍보디 차와 뒤지기 동아 세디레 세상 디나신 풍보디다 데니기 동아디다 레다 녀모 온게 중에 풍보디 다 가지갈래 캡디가 와다 심제 레다 녀모 코와레 깨와 랭겐 차상 길로 여되게 지레샤 선비게 두스네 삼당고레제 뭐 차와두지 동아 임베 동아 라시 임베 아니 동아 라시제 마도 동아마도 동아의 라시 마도 대위 라시 준세게 미두 세데네 자 동아의 라시 마도 대와시 라시 세 준세게 미두 선비게 되네 삼당고레제.
Building on the reflections over the past couple of months and the various sufferings that humans experience, we come back here to the presentation of the threefold division of suffering. So through these previous meditations, we would have had a stronger feel for the subtler levels of suffering that we experience. And now it's being summarized, showing that merely having these contaminated aggregates, physical and mental, we will always experience suffering of varying degrees of coarseness, but nevertheless, our very existence, our very experience is pervaded by suffering. Hence, the sentence ends with all-pervasive suffering. These aggregates, these contaminated aggregates, these appropriated aggregates, are in the nature of suffering. They are an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. And the text continues, because cyclic existence is by nature all-pervasive suffering. So reading this, we remind ourselves that this is the experience, of course, not just of ourselves and our fellow human beings, but so too of all samsaric beings. Wherever they are born within cyclic existence, no matter how good their experiences are, even like in the God realms, they are still bound within cyclic existence. And this means they will continue to take uncontrolled rebirth, which means at the point of death, no matter how good a life, what pleasurable experiences one has had in one's life, the time of death, there's always the grave danger that one will fall again into the lower realms, as well as then continuing to suffer from aging, sickness, and death. So this point of the reflection here, we remind ourselves that our situation in all samsaric beings is that we continue from life to life without any control to circle in cyclic existence, going from rebirth to rebirth to rebirth, experiencing suffering upon suffering, and always in danger of falling into the lower realms. And then the line continues. You never know any joy or happiness not coated or embraced by misery and frustration. So this concludes this presentation that when we've looked at both the 3 types of suffering and the 8 types of suffering, we see that even what we desire is in the nature of suffering. Even the pleasure that we experience, this too is in the nature of suffering. You never know any joy or happiness not coated or embraced by misery and frustration. And this is the situation for samsaric beings. In brief, then, this last half sentence shows that in samsara, there is no happiness to be experienced.
아니 기계네 가간고 나야다 치야 시로야 차기도 매와 차로야도 디네 자다 네 풍보 될 때네 당 아주 갈리고 왔으나 네 풍보 될 때네 아주 풍보 소고로한테 칼라사고선 세 풍보디 최기 된다랑 아주 칼라게 된다라 아니 가시게 소주지야 당 아니 식샘쟁게 세와지야 아니 샘쟁게 빠과 아주 배제 다야 아니 직제 아니 소수기 단 유체에 되는 튕겨 주야라 안 이제야 자서 시고야 시행고 당 거야 아니 구마 자와 되네 제겐디게 마치 되네로 와데 온두신 리고 되네게 토네 안 그냥 시야야 준 시고야 추수 시고야다 되네게 안 콩라야 안 지지 두신의 연구 제상 풍부 될 때는 연구도 선배게 되네게 삼다 안 되네게 삼단다 풍부디 예세회 진실라 동아 유외 동아 차상 디레샤 차상다 레다 녀모 풍부세야데 당 디풍보데 닝보 자와기네 민도와 선배게 되네 삼다도 가르리고르세네 나서 줄에 풍보다 착백이 착신 현바도 도고래 현바 당아도 그디나 랑 지징이 랑 풍보들 그디나 아주 신네 끼네 마시바도 풍보 쳐야 된다 레글리고로 왔더니 누로 데리자 차상 제로 요야지 노래 칼라세 차상 디나 디수부디 쳐야 된다래 아니 루제자다 수부디 야고야제 루제자다 아니 수주야다 아니 지게 놈주야다 차차가 디 수부디 된다라 야고지 영향이 된다라 디지고로 와 진짜 아 저기 체디장장게 차신디 풍보를 아주 된다도 삼단 저저기 자와다 나를 고구스비 가진 디게 풍보를 되니게 아주기 두 삼단에 안징아 저기 다 말리고 진짜 디네지네 딩아 저기 풍보들의 견도도 진의 심주 견도 더 제바지도 제바지도 세상 견기 라신 레샤 삼백 삼단에도 될 풍보들의 체들의 풍보들의 차바의 현바디 슈충 두거래 대충으로도 가시 와서 다 대대닝 보면도 될 야가지 고구도 섬거로 받아 다 야가디 가르러서는 디 용에 간주 풍보 용에 규디 가르서는 레다 녀몬 볼 때는 중어르샤 세상 디 야고면 다 야가고 가르고서는 세상 가야다 나야다 누가균의 모양의 풍보지 그거로 봐. 이 풍보디 자 준비되고 톱네 안데 장시sem바 파베고 방 톱네 마도 탈바 톱네 마도 영화 매라. 제가 탈바디 되니시나 딜레 탈비게다 누가 딜레 탈비 타고도 딜레 탈비게 탈바 타고도 선비게 삼로도 신내리고 왔다디 삼로 숙심을 두고 제가 안 주게 된균 슈주까지 균 숙치 못 통하나 어디 탈바 되니게 삼로도 숙치에 두고
Just to make my translation first a little clearer, the last segment. This second part of the last line here, what this points to is that there is no lasting happiness to be found anywhere within samsara. So this presentation then we've been looking at for the last couple of months, it is these are topics to be meditated on, and the particular type of meditation is that of analytical meditation, where one analyzes one's situation here in samsara. One starts with looking at one's own experience, looking at one's own aggregates, in other words, our mental aggregates, and our physical aggregates. Seeing firstly that this rebirth is something that was attained without any direct control from ourselves. Our karma propelled us. It wasn't a free wish, our karma propelled us. Moreover, all the suffering experiences, such as that of aging, illness, and death, these we don't have control over. They spontaneously come to us. They come for us, whether wanted or unwanted, they come to us. And then, moreover, we need to really look at how we live our life, in particular at our mental process, coming to see that so much of our mental process is directed towards achieving the happiness of these aggregates: physical health, physical comfort, and mental happiness. We need to take a close look at our thought processes, come to see just how dominated they are by overcoming temporary problems and frustrations and annoyances in order to have what we think, what we hope is some mental peace, some happiness. And likewise, the partner set of thoughts are directed towards our body. What we're going to eat, how we can make it delicious. Do we need to exercise? Is this enough? What kind of exercise? All of these thoughts to sustain this body. And then in order to have the type of lifestyle we long for, to have happiness, mental happiness and physical comfort, we need to work, and this often involves negativity, taking advantage of others, deceiving others, and so forth. And likewise, when we engage in activities for fun, for pleasure, these often also involve harm. We get upset, we take advantage of others, and so forth. So we need to look very closely at how we have lived our life thus far. Because the purpose of all these reflections up to here are to bring about a feeling of disenchantment with how we've lived not just this life, but this whole process that has gone from beginningless lives up to now and will continue unabated unless we take control. We need to see that samsara itself has no essence, is nothing worthy of striving for in samsara, because there is no happiness that is lasting, that can be attained in samsara. Every pleasurable experience we've had has ended and has left us with suffering, longing to experience it again, desiring it again, life after life after life. And there's nothing that we can attain within samsara that will give us our longed for happiness. So this is what we need to come to see. It's come to develop this sense of disenchantment, dissatisfaction with what we have experienced thus far. Coming to see that what dominates every thought, and thereby our speech and our activities, our physical activities, are this desire for happiness. And all the happiness we've experienced thus far is transient, is temporary, it has no value. Our deepest hope is to bring an end to suffering, to experience lasting, stable happiness. And this is what guides us, what drives us. But we've never experienced this. And we know in quiet moments when we look within that there has to be something better than this. And here it's through hearing about the Dharma that we come to see that there is a state, that of the state of an Arhat who has achieved nirvana, or an Arya Bodhisattva, or of course a Buddha, they have achieved something better than this, the state of lasting, stable happiness. And it's when we come not just to an intellectual understanding of that, not just to our mind merely moved in meditation, but when we have developed it through repeatedly meditating on this topic, develop this wish so that our mind is intent at all times to ensuring that every thought and resulting activity of speech and physical behavior is directed towards achieving liberation. This is what we're striving for. This is our goal.
차와주 dunga 풍보된 가르치 기고 가능스 영화를 했으면 야 율을 제바지고 다고 니 유디 매바 마서나 니 매바 수투에 매바래 와 세상 풍보된 안에서 위에 차반자 다 마홍바는 안에서 니 풍보된 말해야기 톱톱시 가르치고 그랬으나 다디된 안에서 풍보되다 줍차래다 매바 수는 니 안에서 영화라고 와래 세상 매바 수에 매래 다 가르치고 그랬으나 마홍바나다 데니기 풍보된 마양게 돈달라 탑시 가르도 섬 제바치여도 세상 아주 디게디 귀디 풍보디 귀디 가르게 왔은 세상 레다 녀몽발레드네 깨와레스 세상 디는 녀 레다 녀몽발레드네 깨완자 다조 녀몽발레샤 세상 녀몽바드 방구도 무슨베게 다 제바치네 녀몽바드 방구레스 다 녀몽바 나네 장 이 망보여를 나네 다 녀몽바 자와데 가레 세디 다신세디 마릭바세 nga 시방아 라신이 데마투바 짐바 다세 마릭바세 되샤서 제가 다세 마릭바드 빵구도 진짜 다세 마릭바 빵구래서 제가 당한 중에 다세 마릭바 빵야기 된다래 배치치고 당한 중에 다들 풍벌이야 倦단에 倦다위기 제부들에 가르쳐 왔으네 내내기 倦자 디이게 규디 가르쳐서 규리야 제바제야 용야다 만주기 倦들을 따고래 지상은 낮에도 하고나 낮에 용서 규디 가르쳐서네 규디 하고 용도 규디 나중에 규디 매버서야기 맨 두고어와 지난 디나신 아 풍보대 倦다 倦통에도 디용야 규디 가르쳐서도 다 레다 녀모바들 내기도 디나냐 자다 녀모바세 쪼어셔서 디방고도 어선비다 녀모바 빠야디 다디 규디 하고 녀모바 방고지 倦데 녀모바 하고 그래서 녀모 빠야려야 탑시 배주지고 그래지
Just like in our everyday life, when we seeing that potentially before us comes an unwanted situation, recognizing that that is a result that comes from causes, we will seek to identify those causes and ensure we do not accumulate them, because we don't want that result. Likewise, when there is something that we do desire and we do want, we identify that is a result that comes from causes, and in those causes we strive to accumulate. So we do this in our everyday life continuously, and we need to do that here too. When you recognize that as long as we continue to take uncontrolled rebirth in samsara, we will always have these contaminated aggregates, these appropriated aggregates, and we will always suffer. Recognizing this, becoming disenchanted with this continued process of circling and cyclic existence, giving rise to a longing to be freed of suffering and pain, we will then start to look for a skillful technique. So firstly, we recognize that these aggregates we have are contaminated. This doesn't mean we need to destroy them. We have them. What we need to do is use our intelligence and utilize these contaminated aggregates the most skillful way possible. Destroying these aggregates will not help us. We need to transform them through utilizing them well, skillfully. But how were these aggregates achieved or attained? It was through uncontrolled rebirth. Rebirth that is propelled by our contaminated karma. How was that contaminated karma accumulated? By our own afflicted minds. So if we think, if I get rid of my contaminated karma, I will no longer have contaminated aggregates. This is true. But we need to eliminate all our contaminated karma. It's not possible whilst we still have afflicted minds. It's afflicted minds we need to get rid of. Because it's these that lead to the accumulation of contaminated karma, and that leads to appropriated aggregates, contaminated aggregates. So in the stream of cause and effect, we go from afflicted minds to contaminated karma to contaminated aggregates. So it's the afflicted minds. These are what we need to destroy. This is the cause that leads to all our unwanted results of suffering. And then if we go a little bit deeper, we say, amongst the many types of destructive emotions or afflicted minds, is there a single root? There's one root cause, and that is ignorance, in particular, the ignorance of self-grasping. It's from this one cause that all the afflicted minds come, and therefore all contaminated karma is accumulated, and therefore we continue to take uncontrolled rebirth and have these contaminated aggregates. So here in the meditation, we come to the point of determination that my afflicted minds, these are what I must focus on eliminating. The afflicted minds are my true enemy. These are what I need to destroy.
dunga nyoya ke le ka se sa yo ne nyo mo ba de pa sha ba ne le de de bu mi ya yo ma de dunga nyo thu ma de che sa ko le de le je bu nyoya dunga nyoya ke le ka se sa yo ba yin ne ya ma ju nyo mo ba de pa ba yin na ane le ge de bu dunga de min du yong go ma de yong thu go ma de ka se ne be na ga ju de pe ro s men be ne jing ga ju sa ben mang go shu che ben dun do je ge ndo da de ne ge je ge sa ba mang ga ju yo be ne Delia Kin Chudan Sadan Dread you got it. Kiena Chudan Dread Mena and then Gaze Saban Gazi Yovene, New Jagunamare, Gitugo Mare. Chesa that called Dina Shiri, Azuki, Koake, Dumanyoeg, Julia Gaze, Sa Yobanea, D. Leg Jibumi Balakin, Numo but Gore. Chesa Numo but the Pan Shabana, Nimbo Tinge, Pan by Meva Shabana. Legi 제부 이미 돼야 동아 용도 말해. 안에 다들 저기 레 사야 돼. 녀모바 당보 녀모바 찍게. 녀모바를 때 레사바 사고 그래. 제가 녀모바도 매바 서셔바네 레사바 사야요 말해. 제가 동아 용야게 레 사바 사투 말해. 녀모바 매바 서바나. 제가 녀모바 빵바 있는 녀마게 레가제 동아녀 레사 서바네 디 제부 동아 민투야요 말. 제가 디네자 레다 녀모바는 조왕아도 녀모바 빠야디 예체 차고 그래.
It's important here that it's very clear to us that it's the afflicted minds that we have to focus on eliminating. Because one may have the mistaken understanding that it's actually our contaminated karma that needs to be eliminated, because it's from our contaminated karma that we achieve these contaminated aggregates. But no matter how much contaminated karma is on our continuum, if we have been successful in eliminating the afflicted minds, that contaminated karma cannot ripen, because the contaminated karma because the afflictions serve as the ripening condition for the contaminated karma. So just like if one has a lot of seeds, if they don't have the required conditions of the specific type of soil, moisture and warmth, those seeds cannot ripen. So likewise, no matter how many karmic seeds we have on our continuum, if we have eliminated the afflicted minds, those seeds cannot ripen because there are no ripening conditions for them. So this is one key reason why we need to focus on the afflicted minds. The second is that through eliminating the afflicted minds, we will accumulate no further contaminated karma either. So therefore, the two reasons to focus on the afflicted minds is one, previously accumulated contaminated karma cannot ripen if we have eliminated the afflictions. Moreover, through eliminating the afflictions, we will accumulate no further contaminated karma.
어디네 영화저 기엔 추당 사당 추당 매바이나 네 사번 유고지가 사번 가져야나 유고지 두 말에 아니 기두 말에 안 기엔 추당 사매나 매나 아니 마오바는 유고지가 사번 사바라 두야 매로와 사부 두야 매로와 같은 돈도 기가 말봐 디나시리 아주 요모 빵바이나 매바 쇠샤바이나 님보 땡지 요모바 매바 쇠바이나 녀마게 레가제 사쇼바네 디티부 민두 말에 ane le devo sardo sagi mare sashi disi ure.
Just to emphasize the point then with analogy, is that no matter how many seeds one may have, without the conditions of earth, moisture, and warmth, those seeds cannot sprout. Likewise, furthermore, if those seeds are not sprouting, they cannot grow into plants, creating further seeds either. So therefore, the ripening conditions need to be eliminated. In our case, that's the afflicted minds.
단 유모 방바디 개체 자당 아주 유모 방야디 방탕들라 간스 단 냠는 제야디 간스 제고를 해야 되네. 단 저기 내가 유모바 마지에게 가야 될 양주 링아 있음 예제되면 출임소에 들어와도 진이 링아 있음 요건 예바 지금 매 선배 삼다디 예치 뭐 차고래 디체 예치 뭐 출임소야 돼 안디 양 거두거두래 녀모바 가래 끼기나 델이야 온고 제 빼나 저기 지 유지를 미비기 차고 끼기요 배나 아니 유지를 미비기 미두보kom이야다 미두보kom 노스제네 안데 지게 곧 델에 미두보kom 바이나 유지를 미비 차고 도르고 차고도야 아니 유텔레 미베 콩로 사기나 아니 미텔이야 유텔레 미베 잠바다 저고 잠저고 뭐 내가 고 가이마도 녀모바 사보나 제바 가도 마디기 이제 잠저고 묘도 내가 호 녀모바 텔이야 아니 콩로 마기야기 아니 캬바 가도 거래 아니 유텔레 잡아게 바이나 텔레 유텔레 미두바 균 미두바 콤바이나 유텔레 미베 잡아 가도 거래 가고 내가 ngaje sosugi nyumo ngaje tigiyo baina an sosurana kya rangle ya thebi ke an konchugi yende theada sosogi an mitaba samta sosugi sosuli an mitaba samta soso ngaje jaya anji denegi anji be jik dyangam chimbo shuge baina denegi nyumo dela tigiyo dela ngoso kaya delya an döshung chokshe samta ya döshung chokshe döchung dyangam 다들 어느 알고 우리 집 보고 이고 세저로 받아 가세라나 배는 가세라나 더는 디고 준비 직세도 대항 슈치 무세로 하되네 안 될래야 아주 니버대야 돼 조시고만 조시고면 돼 되네지야다 지금 쌤 남이야 먹고 봐 가지갈 직다 말은 남이야 먹을리기나 될래 집에 대한 저기 안에 바이오금 띵이지 제직도 집이 띵이지 삼다베는 남이야 되게 맛이야다 가서래 어두세 봐 바이오금 봐 어두세네 근데 그두기 내가 녀목가리 숙제네 되네기 그두들이야 까야기 마야기 탑람디 디수제 들어와
Having identified then where we need to focus our attention, the next question of course will be, so how do I then eliminate these afflicted minds? So always then with the Buddha Dharma comes down to training our minds, developing knowledge and meditating on it, and thereby training our minds, transforming our minds. So here, there are two key points to start with. The first is to develop an ethical outlook, cultivate the mind of ethical restraint. So ethics is crucial. So in brief, we need to cultivate the ethical restraint of restraining our body, speech, and mind. And what this means is that we ensure what the mind of ethics means, what the mind of ethical restraint means. We restrain our mind from coming under the influence of the afflictions. So what is meant in Buddhism by ethics is a mind where one restrains oneself from coming under the influence of the afflictions. This is the key point to training. And sorry, I mentioned two, it's actually one. It's these two combined, yeah? So it's ethical restraint, which means ensuring that the mind doesn't come under the influence of the afflictions. And this is done through being mindful, through being aware of our mental process, seeing what minds are ripening, what consciousnesses are ripening. And as soon as we recognize an affliction starting to arise, to apply the antidote. This is how one is ethical. As soon as one notices, first, one's mindful. Secondly, as soon as one notices an affliction arising, one eliminates it. For example, when desire or attachment starts to arise, we either separate ourselves from whatever we are feeling desire for, attachment for, or we remind ourselves of the faults of the object, so we don't see it in this exaggerated way that has led to attachment. Or if we feel anger of whatever strength, frustration, annoyance, we feel that affliction arising within us, then generate love and compassion or patience towards whomever we are starting to feel annoyed towards or frustrated towards. If we notice the affliction of pride arising within us, remind ourselves of the qualities of others, such as of teachers and bodhisattvas and Buddhas, with innumerable qualities greater than ours, seeing that we don't have a valid basis for our pride. Or think of impermanence. This life of ours is going to end. What have I got to be so proud about? I am not freed of uncontrolled rebirth. Or if we see the affliction of insatiability arising, where we desire more and more, what we have is never enough, we always want more. We need to generate contentment, recognizing that what we have is sufficient. And lastly, if we perhaps notice the mind is distracted, then bring ourselves back to whatever object we're meditating on. Bring ourselves back to, for example, the importance of ethics, and bring our mind back there from whatever we are distracted to. So this is the key point to overcome the afflictions. Develop ethical restraint by ensuring, which means ensuring our mind doesn't come under the influence of the afflictions.
디 장모디 매바 소야라 디 도조 차와치 고로 차위 죄시 고로 지난 차위 죄디게 장모디 매바 소야도 그래 장메 소야디게 죄디게 가서 장모디게 다 자자디게 차위게 자자 차비 매바 소야도 군이 직직 내고로 안디 나제 양저기 콩르 깨바 있나 콩르디 잠제 삼다바나 콩르 냐갑가도 고래 안 유디라 차과기 위에는 델야 안에 균다 미두바 삼다바나 안에 거는 저기 델야 차바데 가도 고래 대신 아주 풍부들이야 아주 풍부리야 동아이라시리 집에 지금 아주 풍부들다 동아일 때네 동아 영화데 가위 동아 치유 동아 아니 지 동아 뇌치기도 유에 동아 뇌치기도 풍부들 동아이라시리샤 섬 되네 섬다에도 아주 풍부들에 차바번 거로 차바도 숙체르고 다디 풍부들이 니고면도 섬비게 섬레용 저 풍부들에 차바번 거로 제가 차바도 숙충던 거로 되네기 다 내가 매봐서 마도 디수 공백이 녀모부터 자와니 매봐서 두고 말디 내가 맞게라 고주 가투 거래 진짜 자원이 매봐 수도 말. 난 녀모버 자원 매봐 쇠발라 딱 가르치 거래 남네. 대수 녀모버 차상 용사게 자원이 가화된 리그르스네. 나 세베 좀나 다도 줘봐지면 다신 데리들 리고래. 진짜 나저 콘로기데 갈기고서 나 삼다데. 나래야 코에디네 랍송선 람사디네 콘로기도 다보 나서 삼르 리응고래. 진짜 나 세야디 삼르네. 된 코에 나래야 균주치기도 나래야 통주 당고도 좀 냥 코르게야 나래야 로버 제마서 좀 코르게야 리기로와 내네 코르라데 나세 당보 나섬 섬데 나진레 되네 코르리고래 다 되샤게 디게 당보다가 섬두 간스키도 두 심주치네 당보 나세 나진기오래 나지다 오닝슈 딩알 고고도 세비요 Di jala de ngal ko do, di ngal ko so jada. An di ngai sa ko, jabu nga se de ni sini chakwa le ko. Nga ye de ye kan le ko sa, de nga sa bo nga de ko, nga sa something 콜레 때 나타게 됐어. 나 연된 치겠어. 되네 거 현재 통주다. 세상 녀모 봐. 되샤 콘도 나야 되니기 차상 지금 녀모 망 자와도 가르치리고서 나 세베 나 다도 주버지면 다진 들리고 그래. 세상 녀모 보여서 자와도 나 다도 다진 인자 코 매바 방샤바 있나? 녀모 봐 세상 자와는 방주 그래. 그래서 다 녀모 봐 자와는 방야기 탑시대 가르치고서 나 다도 주버지면 다진디 방야기 매바 소야게 탑람을 배주시고 그래. 제
The process of applying antidotes to the afflictions is a similar process to what we do in our everyday life. If we're a little cold, we engage in what's opposite to that. We get near a heater, we gather some warmth. Then we get too hot, then we need a bit of cool air. Maybe we turn off the heater or take off a sweater. So in other words, when we have a problem in one direction, we look for the solution which is opposite, which will be opposite to that problem. So this is the same with the afflictions. When we commit to being ethical, we're being mindful of our mental process and we notice that an affliction has arisen. We need to immediately then apply the antidote, and the antidote to the affliction tends to be something that's opposite to it. So if attachment or desire arises, we think about the faults of what we attach to, what we desire, because we desire it because we see it as so greatly desirable. We remind ourselves of its faults, such as it cannot satiate us. Or if we're angry, or frustrated, or annoyed, then we generate love, or compassion, kindness, tenderness towards whom we are angry towards. So these kinds of antidotes are important to train ourselves in, so that we become very habituated to them, in that as soon as we recognize an affliction arising, we know which antidote to apply. And if we're familiar with the antidote, not just in recognizing what to apply, but we have some experience of it, immediately it will have a soothing impact on our afflicted mind. And we will be able to maintain our ethics. So these are important to training, these antidotes. But these antidotes are only temporary restraints. They temporarily suppress or restrain our afflictions. They cannot eliminate them. So therefore, once a little skilled in these antidotes, we need to start to training in firstly recognizing the root of all our afflictions, and then eliminating that. So the root of all our afflicted minds is the ignorance of self-grasping. What that means is, it's from our sense of self that all our afflictions follow. The sense of self, due to having the sense of self, the self-identity, based on that, or in dependence on that, the thought of I want comes. The thought of I don't want comes. And another way to express this is attachment and anger follows. I want means I desire something, or I want may mean I don't want something, I want to repel it. So in this way we see attachment and anger coming. So to the sense of pride, thinking with a sense of self-identity, seeing oneself as having greater qualities than others, and thereby looking down on others. It's from our sense of self, our self-identity, that all the afflictive minds follow. And as we start to weaken and reduce this ignorance of self-grasping, we weaken the strength and frequency of our afflictions. And eventually, when we are able to eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping, we eradicate all the resultant afflicted minds and prevent the accumulation of any further contaminated karma or ripening of contaminated karma. And that is because the ignorance of self-grasping is the root cause of this entire process of cyclic existence. It is the root of all our suffering.
단 잠재 공명도 샬라 뇌베 삼바 콩도 뇌베 삼바 디게 마자야 근데 가소리 미두바다 되니게 되쇼 초시어 공명도 한 디텔이야 착비기 착바디게 봐야 가야 내가 가야 디 내가 되쇼 초시 되고 충충 초시 전에 되바 침부 가루 착바 침부디 가루라 어디 가야 돼 내가 대수기 공백이 자위 내가 묘모버디 내가 가도 그러면도 자원윤이 매버스 두고 말해지래 가르치는 수에 두고 말해라나 묘모버 용서게 자와디 다세 마리바들와 지사 잠재 공백에 다세 마리바를 누고 말해 내게 아주 같이 나타난 저기 잠재 삼다 다세 마리바 삼갑을야 숙체냐 오가가 네 잠재 공구에 네 직지지교 선비 네 냠는 지교 선비 맞은 숙체를 내가요 지상도 잠재 공부하다 아니 지게 대충 쇼시어 공부 아니 안지 미두버 공야 되니기다 녀모바 내가 되니기 녀모바 내가 공야 매버스게 같이 냠는 제베네 대속이 녀모바 자와디네 빵마토버디 가르지에래 람나 녀모바 자와네 계세기 제위규 다지 마리 버들을 누고 말레스 마뉴바인자 고주기 녀모 내가 매버스 가 두그레 마도 자와기는 매버스 두고 말레스 지나 마투비 김센디 녀모바 자와 용서게 규 다지 마리 벌을 누고 말해지 I've
mentioned then several antidotes to afflicted minds, so I'll mention a few more. So when we be mindful of our mental process, and we notice we're a little bit lazy. There, the antidote to apply is joyous perseverance, the mind that delights in virtue. So if we're lazy in the sense of we don't feel like engaging in virtue, we generate the mind of joyous perseverance, reminding ourselves of all the benefits of engaging in virtue and generating thereby joy in doing so. Likewise, where we have an opportunity to help ease the suffering of others, to give to others, if we notice though the affliction of miserliness arising, then the antidote is to generate the wish to give, the wish to help, to be of benefit to others. Or if we notice the mind of harmful intent, the wish either to bring harm to others or for harm to come to others, if we notice that affliction, generate love and compassion for them. And again, if desire or attachment arises, generate content. Be content with what one has. One doesn't always need new and more. But these, as well as the other antidotes I mentioned earlier, these are temporary restraints. They restrain the mind temporarily, enabling us to continue to keep our mind ethical. But they cannot directly harm the root of all our suffering. The root of all our suffering is the ignorance of self-grasping. And no matter how much we meditate on, for example, love and compassion or any of these temporary antidotes, as powerful as love and compassion gets within us, it cannot eliminate or even directly harm the ignorance of self-grasping. In fact, there's a danger that even if we generate powerful love and compassion within us, Strong pride may arise, thinking, aren't I wonderful? My meditation's going so well. I'm better than others. Here, our ignorance of self-grasping is perhaps growing. Certainly, it's being expressed as pride. So these temporary antidotes cannot eliminate the root cause of cyclic existence, the ignorance or cannot, directly harm the root cause of cyclic existence, the ignorance of self-grasping.
다 대소 냠는 전에 녀모 맞자와는 빵 투고 말되는 냠는 제마지 민도 선비게 나 심주 차야게 냐하여 봐. 당저기 저 녀모 맞자와는 마반년에 나주 가지 녀모 가진 마기에게 탑시 제디 예치 뭐 차고 와다 대소 냠 탑시 지기 지는 녀모 맞자와는 빠야게 탑시고 봐. 제가 삼나 어다 대소 녀모 가지 삼다는 녀모 자와는 빠야 민도 된지 제가 삼다야 담마다 개와 민도와 선비게 삼노요시로 제가 저기 녀모 바자와는 빵마두기네 디소바 마기에 디파 제바네 고 제바네 아주기 디르바 베네 녀모 바자와는 빠야디 니글리글리시네 좀 두비알라 냠네치알라 레라용으로 봐 제수 기네 맞제 고 녀모 와지게나 끼주버이나 디네 녀모 바자와는 빠야게 탑람디 기네 용 말로 와다 고 아주기 가제네 충충 마 디가 그 전부도 마 가고 마 도신 남사 안디가 토에 전부도 가토에 매로와
If you have the thought then, well, what's the point of all these temporary antidotes if they can't eliminate the root cause? No need to bother with them, not so important. That is a mistake. Another thought of, if I can't overcome this root cause, I'm in a helpless situation. Might as well just give up. That's also a mistaken thought. But there is a great purpose, though, of coming to understand well these temporary antidotes and becoming skilled in applying them. They are essential. So we know that we are not helpless. There is a technique to eliminate the ignorance of self-grasping. But if we try and focus just on that, we will struggle to make any progress. We have to become skilled in applying the temporary antidotes, because the temporary antidotes are what enable us to practice ethical restraint, to develop an ethical outlook, to not be under the influence of the afflicted minds. And why is this a crucial foundation? Why is ethical restraint the crucial foundation? The more ethical one's mind is, the less afflicted one's mind is. That means one's mind is more on virtue. Amongst the many positive effects of having a mind more focused on virtue is that one has more mental space due to the mind being calmer. Having a calmer mind, a less distracted mind, a less afflicted mind, having more space, one then has a foundation to make rapid progress against eliminating the ignorance of self-grasping. Make rapid progress against eliminating the root cause of all our suffering, of cyclic existence in its entirety. So therefore, training in these temporary antidotes is crucial because it enables us to be ethical.
나는 저기 녀모 자와네 방바들은 다신 방고래라로 다신 방에 대한 방고래라나 다신 난뇌에는 수는 것은 다음에 봐도 별로 되고 그래다. 그래서 다음에 봐도 별로 다신 들어오는 뇌에는 다음에 봐도 별로 되고 그래. 그래서 거기기 다도 주버지면 다신 람나 가 세디 그냥 긴 강라이마도 랑원이 주버진되긴 최고로 봐. 그래서 디 진되긴데 다음에 봐도 봐지기 그냥 긴 강라마도 랑원이 주버자오기 민도 선배 또 불러지 다음에 봐도 불렀어요. 거기 다 진당원 원가 차고. 그래서 다음에 봐도 불러지 곰고 그래. 곰제 다 곰바이나 된 다진디 남자와네 방투고. 그래서 뭐수 뇌캔디 수뇌 것은 다음에 봐도 불러지 곰 디게 뇌고 제지 디 곰고 그래제. 네 되네 자랑은 저기 디 곰고 그래. 디 곰네 방투고 그래제.
As we develop the basis of ethical restraint, we then can make rapid progress against eliminating the root cause of all suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping. So just like all the afflictions have their own respective antidotes, so too does ignorance of self-grasping. Its antidote, its contrary mind, the contrary mind to ignorance is wisdom. And which specific wisdom is the contrary mind to the ignorance of self-grasping? It's the wisdom realizing selflessness. Or to express it differently, the wisdom realizing emptiness. So here, the meditation is first to come to see how the self appears, which is that it appears to be independent and unchanging. And then when one realizes that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, the self is not independent and unchanging, the mind that realizes that is the mind of wisdom, wisdom realizing selflessness, realizing that the self doesn't exist in the way that it appears. And it's this wisdom that is able to abandon the root cause of all suffering.
Dela tene da kayu dunga nayu dunga chiyu dunga 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 gyu dunga chasa dela tene yung chasa di tene gi dunga di phungpo de da dunga gi rangshin resha chasa di da gar gyu gar tene kiyo da le da nyom ba le tene kiyo re sa ji da nga di nyom ba de de pang pe pang ba chi pang gu du san bi di ma ba ma da ta men du san be sam da de nga ju gi pang pe pang ba to gu du san be sam da de ge chi mo cha wa da nga ju gi phungpo de le gyuen da gyuen da ne de nga ju gi di pang pe gi di ya gyu di nyom ba re de nyom ba be pang ba tar ba sa to gu du san be sam da de nga ju du chen sam da je da de ne za da nga ju gi dan de ne gi nyom ba ne ga ma ge le ya ngong wa che le ya ju lu nga yi sum ji go ne an lu ji nie jue在的早年这个没身边出这么送下来，能讲这什么大呀的，我都是现在什么大呀的给的那些，我觉得的那些的，呀，我就的我下定的我说说让我在学了吧的，我下的干那都身边说说让说说个落了呀，我下的落了呀，下样对，我是落了下对。你落的了，我是干那是能够读，把这个这个什么呀当什么大节，都是那干那是能够读，身边个结巴了姐姐，落了下堂去，怕结巴结的也是没吃过的。那这嘛的来的这个大面皮过结巴些这些安的，推动啊的结巴推啦，推动啊的。他们拿他的这个东西我学的这些。
Then to summarize what we've looked at tonight. So in brief, we've come to recognize that these contaminated aggregates that we have are an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. And as long as we have contaminated aggregates, we will suffer, because they are the basis for physical and mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness. It's through having these aggregates that we suffer. And in dependence on the meditations that have been done, on the eightfold division of suffering, as well as the threefold division of suffering, one comes to see that as long as one has these contaminated aggregates, one will continue to suffer. And one will never experience lasting, stable happiness. And this we need to reflect on repeatedly to see that there's no lasting, stable happiness that can be found in samsara, and therefore it's samsara itself that needs to be abandoned. And that means abandoning contaminated aggregates. And then we spoke about the causes of the contaminated aggregates, primarily the afflicted minds. And here then, I encourage you to meditate on ethical restraint. What that means is restraining our way of thinking, our minds, ensuring that our mind is not under the influence of the afflictions, because if the afflictions arise, immediately our mind being afflicted will create negative karma, and we will act under the influence then of these destructive emotions, and our physical and verbal behavior will be non-virtuous. So being ethical means ensuring that our mind remains virtuous. It's never non-virtuous. In other words, under the influence of the afflictions. And therefore, to bring this about, to be ethical, we need to train in the antidotes, so that whenever we are mindful that an affliction is arising, we can apply the appropriate antidote, such as love and compassion and contentment and so forth. So that is a key meditation to engage in every day. Now, next week, part of what we will look at is on the meditation that we alluded to tonight, and that is how to meditate and give rise to the wisdom realizing selflessness, the wisdom realizing emptiness. So we'll look at that next week. And the first step of that meditation, I'd encourage you to spend a little bit of time on this week. And that is to try and get a sense for how your sense of self, your identity appears to you. Because the starting point of developing the wisdom realizing selflessness is to have a clear understanding of how the self appears. So when your self appears, how does it appear to you? So this is a key step. It's difficult, but it is crucial. So if you can spend a bit of time on that, please do. But in particular, cultivate the mind of ethical restraint for all the reasons mentioned. So next week, we'll look at how to cultivate the wisdom realizing selflessness, as well as look at the sufferings of the gods, of the sufferings of beings in the God realms.
Okay.
If you have any questions, then please feel free to ask. Okay, then thank you very much.